Welcome to the podcast for Healing Neurology. Today's guest, Dr. Dan Krashin, is quadruple board certified, and this is my favorite type of conversation. We go all over the place from food banks, social justice, addiction, pain, and specifically dive into headaches in the last half of the show. We're so excited you're here. So welcome to the podcast for Healing Neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything from food, lifestyle, and medicine to nature, culture, and politics. There's no topic too big or too small. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine. And we are here today with Dr. Daniel Krashin, who is a psychiatrist and pain specialist. He works with both inpatient and outpatient pain relief services, clinics, and hospital staff to collaborate on treatment of patients, but also works on improving systems of care delivery that benefit patients and populations across the continuum of care. Dr. Krashin has extensive experience working with the underserved and vulnerable populations, including the chronically ill, recent immigrants, and HIV patients in treatment of both psychiatric illness and chronic pain. He has lectured extensively and authored a number of publications on pain management. He works closely with residents and pain fellows and participates in teaching the future generation of pain relief physicians. He is board certified in psychiatry, pain medication, headache medicine, and addiction medicine. Dr. Krashin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, good to be here.
We are excited to have this conversation, especially in this time currently as we are recording. We are in a quarantine, so where things were kind of hard before, they are definitely different. It's maybe in some ways better, maybe in some ways worse. But I think this is a timely conversation to have about this mix of pain, psychiatry, and addiction. I want to start by saying that addiction is one of my favorite topics, mainly because I think the concept that an idea or a substance kind of grabs our mind and kind of owns it happens all the time in varying degrees. Like it can even be with sugar or chocolate or coffee or screens. There's many times that what we feel we have to do or must do interrupts and directs our lives, but we only call it addiction often when it's an illegal substance or when the imbalance is so great that it destroys our lives as seen from the outside. But addiction's everywhere. So it can be pizza, it can be bad relationships, it can be life patterns like staying up late or not exercising. And sometimes it seems like we even have an addiction to just feeling badly. Otherwise, we'd all have this like perfect life, right? So I'm curious from your perspective and all of your extensive experience, can you kind of lay out for us, what is this? Like, what's the root of this? How are these things connected? And what's the root of pain, psychiatry, and addiction?
Well, that's a big question.
I know. I like starting big.
I'll talk a little bit, and then we can hone in a little bit, or sort of move the camera around, as so to speak, as we go. I think one concept that's really important in thinking about addiction, in particular, and recovery. You mentioned how there's a whole spectrum of different addiction-like behaviors that people have. And there's actually there's a very lively argument among the experts about what counts as an addiction and what doesn't. There are proposed criteria, what we call research criteria, for things like video game addiction, social media addiction. And sometimes those are portrayed as frivolous. And then if you look at the people who are actually specialists in that, there are some people for whom this, if you read about the cases, they do look a lot like addiction from the outside. That's tricky. So one aspect of addiction that's really important and has a lot of relevance for both pain and psychiatry, I think, is what you could call the reward system, or sometimes I like to call it the motivational system. That's the system that it's very deeply rooted in the brain. It's something that we share with pretty much all the other mammals. And so I used to use dogs in talks as a comparison, because I figured that most people had a dog or have been around dogs, know what dogs are like. I found some people would get offended if they felt I was comparing them to dogs. Really what I was talking about is that on this level, dogs and people have an awful lot in common. And that's one of the reasons people love dogs. Dogs are like people, but you might say they're better in some ways. They're more understandable. They're pure. Cats Cats not so much, but cats are also great. All these mammals, and also mice, mice and rats, we all have this motivational system in us. And often when people talk about this, and they talk about the specific area, which is called nucleus accumbens in the brain, you'll hear people talk about it as the pleasure center. Pleasure center is one way of talking about it, but I don't think that's the most useful way to talk about it. The way I like to think about it is if you imagine that your life were a video game, for example, imagine that you, instead of living the life you live, you're PacMan. Okay, I hope young people still know what PacMan is. But you know that PacMan's life is pretty simple. He spends all day running around, eating pellets, and running away from ghosts. Every time he eats a pellet, he gets a point. And if he eats a ghost, then he gets a lot more points. Well, if you imagine that instead of Pac-Man running around a maze, it's a mouse running around a maze, it's not so very different, right? If you have a mouse running around a maze and you put little food pellets in that maze, the mouse, maybe not all at once, but over time, he's going to run around and scoop up all those food pellets. That little center in the mouse brain, which is, again, it's a lot like ours, but smaller, is going to be giving that mouse a reward each time. When we talk about, but you wouldn't necessarily say the mouse is feeling tremendous amounts of pleasure. Maybe they're feeling a reward. It's more like getting points in a video game. You're doing well. Obviously, what seems like obviously is the reason that mouse brains are wired like that is that that's a really good way to get mice to do stuff, which allows them to thrive and make little mice to keep the mouse population going year after year. And so you can imagine the same thing for people, that we have that in our brain. There's a part of it which is sort of treating all this as sort of a big video game, and that a lot of the little pleasures in life, having a nice cold drink of water on a hot day, eating something tasty when you're hungry, those things are pleasurable. But more than that, they also count as points. Those are things that help you survive, especially if you think that our biology is evolved in a time of scarcity. Then things like having good food to eat was not simple. And for some people, it's still pretty difficult, honestly. If you're a caveman, basically, we think that those people in the Neolithic time, they went without food for long periods of time. So if they got food, they would get a big reward for it, especially if it was tasty food with a lot of fat, like a nice fat antelope or something. That's a big reward. It's worth a lot of points in the game of survival. That's a good way to keep a mouse or a dog or a person sort of running down the track, doing things that take care of them. All this works pretty well. The thing is that people, and other animals for that matter, are clever, and it didn't take people very long to figure out how to short circuit the system. So you can think of like when a cat finds catnip and rolls around in it, that cat is basically sort of short circuiting this cheat code. So it's sort of using a cheat code and it's getting extra points from its brain. It's winning the game of life. Now, catnip doesn't actually help that cat survive, but cats seem to think it's really fun, judging from their behavior. And so people have spent a lot of time, over all of history, finding things to do which are pleasurable and fun. If you look at the reward system in the sort of broader sense, a lot of things that we do are sort of rewards, especially if you take a broader sense that we're not just individual organisms like Pac-Man running through an empty maze. We're social creatures. And so one of the things that is very rewarding to people is having relationships with other people. And so you can say that if human life is a game, it's a very complicated game, and there are a lot of different ways to score points. What's happened in human civilization is that we've gotten better at finding these sort of cheat codes. And that's really where addiction comes in to become such a big problem, is that we've gotten awfully good at creating different systems which sort of, you could, in modern terms, you could say sort of hack this reward system. And you can see that in a lot of areas. Wine, for example, has been around for a long time. Distilled liquor has been around a lot less time. Coca leaves have been used for a very long time in the Andes, and they weren't terribly harmful. But It wasn't until the late 1800s that people isolated cocaine from coca leaves, and cocaine became very big, very popular. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychiatry, had a big cocaine problem at one point and actually burned a hole in his nose using cocaine. At one point, he initially thought that because he tried cocaine and said, this makes you feel really good, this must be a really great thing for your mental health. And so he started using it. He gave it to his patients. He thought that this was a really great treatment for depression because, you give it to a depressed person and suddenly they feel a lot better. He made this, it was one of the smartest people in whoever did psychiatry made the same mistake that every single person who's ever had problems with cocaine has made, which is this feels pretty good. It must be a good stuff. The fact is our brain is wired to notice, hey, suddenly I'm getting a lot of reward. My point total, so to speak, is going up very quickly. And so I must be doing something right. As a side note, some of the other behavioral stuff, that's what doctors call as behavioral addictions. So things like playing video games to excess or even gambling, for example. There's a lot of evidence that the way those games are structured, the way gambling is structured, is to take advantage of the way the brain works. Just a very simple example is that one of the most reinforcing ways to give a reward is to not give it every time. So if you reward your dog, for example, or your little kid, with a treat every time they do something, they'll do it more often. But if sometimes you don't do anything and sometimes you give them a really great reward, that will really get their attention and they will increase that behavior a lot more. That's a training technique that people can use. It's also a training technique that video games and gambling facilities use. We don't think of it as training. The fact is, if you go into a casino and you start playing, a slot machine, and you pull the lever 10 times and lose your money, and then on the 11th time, you make all the money back plus a little bit more, that time makes a big impression on you. I'm not a big gambler, but if you know anything about gambling, you look almost all gambling games, whether they're new or old, they all work that way. And that's no accident. It's because that's what makes a gambling game fun and exciting. And like with a lot of the substances I've mentioned already, these things start off as fun and exciting, and then for some people, they become problems very quickly. And that kind of gets to the second point I wanted to make. That's sort of a psychological fact of the way the human brain works. I'm not sure if this part is true for dogs or not, so I'll stop talking about dogs. But when it comes to people, there's really sort of two time frames that we tend to think about: now and later. Neuroscientists have actually discovered in the prefrontal cortex there's actually two different sets of neurons. So you can almost think of this as like a car switching between first gear and third gear or something like that. The names kind of suggest what it is. That now is what am I doing right now? What should I be doing right now? And the later is what should I be doing now that will make sense later? I'll give you a really simple example of this. And by the way, there's one of the people who was a big pioneer of this study was Dr. Kahneman. He wrote a bunch of books like Thinking Fast and Slow, where it gets into this. He did some elegant experiments where, for example, if you ask someone at 8 a.m., what will you have for lunch today? Most people will pick something relatively healthy. I'll say, I think I'll have some grilled fish with a little lemon on top and some mixed vegetables. And then if you ask them at 11:59, 1 minute before they run down and grab something for lunch, in a crowded cafeteria or food court or whatever, you ask them, they'll say, I'm just going to grab something. Pizza sounds good. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the difference between that is that the later part of your brain is kind of thinking ahead and thinking, well, what kind of food is going to be good for me in the long run? And the now part is like, what do I want right now? That later part takes longer to work, and it takes a little more energy to work. So this is really relevant to addiction, is that addiction and addictive type behaviors tend to keep people in the now, where they tend to be focused on what do they need right now. And it short circuits those thoughts about later. I think everybody has had that experience, especially now, where people are staying in and not going to restaurants so much, that decide, am I going to, take time and whip up something fabulous, or am I going to reheat something frozen and eat quickly?
Obviously, there's going to be some difference in what that time is. But if you think like at 11, if you ask a person versus 11:30 versus 10:30, how do you bring those pieces together so that you can actually think ahead and make good decisions and act on them?
Well, this is actually really interesting because it's one of the areas where the psychology overlaps with something that, for example, people in AA meetings have known for a long time, where there's a saying in AA, never get too lonely, hungry, or angry. So it's not just a matter of how soon the time is. One of the big differences between 8 in the morning and noon, it's not just that the decision is a lot closer now. It's also, you're probably a lot hungrier. Breakfast was a long time ago. And so now you're really feeling hungry. And maybe you've spent 4 hours doing Zoom meetings with people with bad reception and trying to handle various stresses. So your willpower stores are kind of depleted. There's another nice experiment where they showing sort of the power of this, where it was one of those clever experiments where they have people doing one thing and thinking that the experiment is about one project, is about one thing that they're testing, when actually they're testing something else, which is barely noticeable to the participants. I like those studies because I think they're a little more honest. And so the study involved people doing something with numbers, and the main difference was that they had to remember numbers. And most people can remember 7-digit numbers. With a little difficulty, anything over 7 numbers is challenging. That's why phone numbers are 7 digits long. And so basically the only difference between these two groups of undergraduates was that one group was memorizing nice short numbers like 3 or 4 digits. The other group was remembering 7 and 8-digit numbers. And then they asked them, while they were working in here, they were saying, by the way, we have a snack arranged for you guys. You have the choice of either a piece of chocolate cake or an apple. Which one would you like? And they just mentioned this in an offhand way while they were doing the experiment. And of course, that was what they were actually interested in. And so what they found is overwhelmingly the people who were doing the harder problems, they all picked the cake. And you think remembering long numbers is mental work, but it's not brain surgery, and it's not ditch digging or anything like that. But even that was enough to sap some of people's mental energy, or brain energy, if you will. And that led to them then making a choice with sort of the now part of their brain, and the now part of the brain, loves sweets and fats and immediate satisfaction. It thinks about that. And it's like, yeah, that's what I want. The more, the better.
So what we're talking about then is the psychology part or the psychiatry part of addiction really is about level of overwhelm in the mind.
That's a very big part of it, yes.
And then the other part of it is a sense of identity. The first piece you were talking about the PacMan, I can see how it's not only about the reward, it's about the perception of the reward, or the perception that we're on track for survival.
Right.
So that we are driven really by those two components.
Well, once you start looking at people this way, you start noticing a lot of things. And one of the things which jumps out a lot to me is if you look at people who are suffering from poverty, on the lower socioeconomic levels, as opposed to people who are, just say comfortable, people middle class above. Both groups might be under a lot of stress. But one of the things which is really noticeable when you look at people's reactions is that the time horizon tends to be shorter for a lot of people who are suffering poverty.
What does that mean, the time horizon is shorter?
Just a very simple example. When you talk to, and this is, I don't want to offend anybody by saying stereotypical, but for someone who's genuinely poor, you ask them, well, what's the biggest financial decision you're going to make? And their decision is, how I'm going to pay rent on the 1st. Okay, maybe they're worrying about that every day, and they're actively working every day to make sure that they're going to have enough money to pay the rent so they can stay in their home. Someone who is middle class, maybe they're thinking about, gee, I'm wondering if I'm on track with my retirement, or is it time to buy a house? Should I try to change my job because this job is not really paying me what I'm worth? Those are all real valid problems. I'm not going to say any of those just what people call first world problems, or those aren't jokes, but those are all things that people have time to think through them frequently, and they have time to consider them. Whereas if you're really trying to figure out how you're going to get through this tricky situation at the end of the month, then asking someone, where do you see yourself in 6 months or a year, like they do in job interviews, that question is going to be very hard for someone to answer if their time horizon is shortened like that. And that feeds into what we've been talking about the now versus later parts of the brain or motivation, that if you get a windfall, the behavior of a lot of people are really suffering from poverty, if they get a windfall, is that often they will spend it relatively quickly. And economists know that. Right now, we're in the middle of this pandemic, which I haven't mentioned too much, but part of it is with the financial crisis, people have been talking a lot about what's the best way to keep the economy going. And one of the things that I've heard on the radio is they said, well, you need to give poor people money because poor people will spend it. They'll spend it on things right away, where if you give it to rich people, they'll hang on to it. And some of that is probably because maybe it doesn't mean as much to them, but some of it is that I think is also this psychology that if you have a small windfall, you get a check you weren't expecting to get, and you're poor, there are a million things that could go wrong between now and the end of the month. So you could set it aside, but you might also get something that you've been needing or really wanting for a while, and get something that's small and concrete that you can then definitely hang on to. If your shoes are wearing out, you can get a new pair of shoes, and then that's one thing that you're not worrying about every day when you go out and worrying that if it rains, that your feet are going to get wet, for example. Whereas putting that in a savings account, when you figure that you're just going to end up taking it out of the savings account within a week because of some ongoing problem, that isn't very, very appealing to people. There's a definite sort of psychology which I think is driven by poverty. And it's one of the things that makes it hard to get out of poverty, I think, honestly, is because it may lead to people missing out on opportunities they have, or not handling them as well as they could. And I think that also is one of the reasons that people in those situations may be more vulnerable and have a harder time recovering from addiction problems.
Absolutely. If you don't have a hope for tomorrow, it's very hard to invest in today.
Right.
What does that look like if, and we're talking about different levels of windfall, certainly the stimulus checks that are coming out, my understanding is they're going to lower income folks first and then kind of slowly working up the ladder in terms of the disbursements. But that amount of money is probably going to go fairly quickly for most people. For people who are raised poor and then are able to financially stabilize, what does that look like as they get older?
I think a lot of people have to go through sort of a process of re-educating themselves and reassuring it. And some of that is sort of learning new reactions, and some of it is being pretty cautious. I'm old enough that I had grandparents who lived through the Great Depression and did the stereotypical things with saving string and folding up aluminum foil into little packets and keeping it in their drawers so they need it again. And it seemed pretty weird to me as a 70s kid that they do these things. And my parents explained that they lived through this time of deprivation. And on some level, my grandparents, who have been passed for a while now, that on some level they weren't sure that those times weren't going to come back, and they didn't want to be caught unprepared.
What happens to wealthy people if they lose their money? Wealthy people in our country, when you have enough money, you don't really get poor. You have enough connections that you can kind of come back. Or what does that look like?
Well, there's a really useful concept in psychology and in the software sciences called social capital, which I think is what you're talking about, that if you are, and basically it's sort of what could loosely be called connections, so that if you lose your job doing A, then, or you even lose your home, then maybe you have relatives who can help you out. And so I guess in these times, that would be someone who, for example, well, there was just a story in the New York Times recently about someone who left Brooklyn during the pandemic and to get away from there, and they moved into their parents' vacation house in New Mexico. And then their parents came and brought them groceries and stuff like that, and they did their quarantine there. So, leaving aside the question of whether that's a good thing to do, I don't think that was the greatest idea. Just having those options of being able to leave your home on short notice, having a car that works well enough to trust it to get all the way across the country, being able to pay for gas, and then having a parent at the other end of the trip who has a whole house that's empty and ready for you and is ready to help support you. All those are very nice things, which a lot of people have, but then other people couldn't even dream of them. That makes a really huge difference. So if two people are sort of both climbing up a mountain and they both fall off, one person is falling onto some hard rocks, and the other person has a belay line, so that they may fall and have a nasty shock, but they have somebody down on the ground who kind of is pulling up the slack and able to save them before they hit the rocks. And that makes a pretty huge difference, not just right in the moment, but then if you look how these people and their kids are doing 5 or 10 years later, it would not be hard to see which person had the fallback and which person didn't. The one, sometimes when a family falls from a great height like that, it'll literally just shatter. The parents will break up, the kids will end up in foster care, getting distributed to various parents or various relatives, and that's sort of the end of the story. So that's a really huge difference.
One aspect of the coronavirus pandemic is that we are looking at a contraction of our economy. A number of us will feel that hit. To use your perfect analogy, if we are now falling off the side of the mountain, we know that some of us are in positions where we can be caught, or we can kind of set up and remember that we have a belay device on and look to who's holding it on the ground for us, or in that social capital world, kind of people with money may hold it for each other. We know that we live in such a stratified society, so that rich people and working class people don't necessarily, or poor people don't necessarily like hang out together. So if there are those of us that do have resource or that do have capacity, how can we put out belay devices for others? What does that look like? If we want to save our whole society, if we want to save our culture, one thing we know is that it requires all of us. In a society with greater inequality, both the poor and the rich die sooner. Our mortality is all impacted. So if we were to stay with a selfish sense of, I want my life to be good, what are some things that we can do? We put the belay device out for others.
Honestly, that's a big question. And I don't want to get super political, but I think this is one of the functions for big organizations to exist. One thing that people have commented about before with American society is that American society has gotten pretty atomized. There was a famous book about 10, 15 years ago called Bowling Alone that talked about how people used to belong to clubs a lot more. Americans were what they called joiners. So if you think of Fred Flintstone in the cartoons, how he belonged to a fraternal order of eagles or something like that. And, lots of people joined that. And aside from churches, there are really not that many clubs that people join as much anymore. People are much more atomized. And of course, right now, people are incredibly isolated because we have a stay-at-home order in a lot of the country, a lot of the world. And so people are largely communicating to each other just over computers, which in itself is super isolating. It probably doesn't have all the vitamins that we need for human communication. I think some of those structures, that are sort of the intermediate structures that are sort of in between individual people and individual families and then the state, I think I think those have kind of atrophied, and we're feeling that now to some extent, that there aren't as many social organizations able to step up. But where you do have them, I think that's probably a really good place to start. Food banks in particular are really important now. People can't go very long without food. And right now, food banks aren't getting donations from restaurants because restaurants aren't doing much business. They're not able, because of safety concerns, they're not able to take donations from individuals. So they're having to buy everything. And at the same time, a lot more people are asking for or needing help with meeting their needs for food. And I've seen some pretty scary looking pictures from other states in the news from places like Texas and other states where they have a drive-up food bank, and there would just be a line of cars that looked like it was hundreds of cars long of people just waiting in line so that they could get a bag of groceries. So, and I think that's a really good example of this sense of we're all in it together. We're all in it together in part because, viruses don't have politics. Viruses don't know about, race or class or anything like that. Viruses just react to the population. So if part of our population is unprotected, then they're really vulnerable. And the homeless population in Seattle, for example, is something I worry about a lot because they're pretty exposed, and a lot of them are facing not great options in terms of living outside, which is pretty dangerous, or going into a shelter, which is also may seem pretty dangerous right now. But another way that everyone is connected is that if people literally can't get food through no fault of their own, historically that's led to bad things happening. You think of the French Revolution, that a big part of that was because there were a few years of failed harvests because of a volcanic eruption. And so people were really hungry. When you hear the famous story about Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake," she was saying that because people are saying the peasants have no bread. And the reasons the peasants had no bread is because there wasn't enough wheat to go around. Wheat was really expensive. And so the peasants were literally starving. When people are hungry and they can't feed themselves or their families, people get desperate and they will do a lot of bad things that because they don't see any other option. So it's incredibly important that we as a society don't back people into a corner like that. Like I said, especially in a society that's a developed country where we actually do have a ton of resources. Like I said, there's no shortage of food. It just isn't distributed very well right now. So that, I think that's a really good place to start, is now volunteering. They may not want or need for volunteers right now. I don't know. You'd probably check out your neighborhood food bank, but I'm sure they'd love donations if you can do it. Helping out. And then I think if you know people in your neighborhood that need help, I think that's a really good place to start in those small areas. And then I think on a bigger sense, letting people, making your voice heard. It's tricky. It's tricky to make your voice heard at a time like this when things are so noisy. I just heard this morning that there's a big demonstration in Michigan, in the capital, where blocked the streets with their cars. Just something we've seen before in France. I don't think we've ever seen it in Michigan. But the idea was a demonstration where people could share their anger with the situation. Short of that, I think making your voice heard at the local, state, national level is pretty important. That can seem like kind of a hopeless task sometimes, but I think it is important, especially for people like you said who are able to speak up and feel like they have the time, the space, and the ability to make their voices heard. Someone someone who doesn't have electricity can, and all the libraries are closed right now, is not going to be able to send emails to their congressman, for example. But those of us who are in that position can speak up.
Yeah.
That kind of brings me one other thing I wanted to mention as far as addiction. I think is a really important point, is that one of the most dangerous things when a recovery from addiction is being alone with your thoughts for too long. I'm not saying, maybe not for every single person, but for a lot of people who have had experience with addiction, they'll find that their brain is pretty good at sort of constructing alternate realities or alternate explanations of things. If you've ever gone to an AA meeting or another 12-step meeting, one of the big things they talk about and there is managing sense of resentment. That's a really interesting topic, but I think part of what that comes down to is that everybody rationalizes all the time. We're always constantly sort of rewriting our life story to make us look better, which is in some ways is totally healthy psychologically. If we were 100% honest with ourselves all the time, it would be kind of crushing.
Yeah.
But it can be kind of dangerous for people who are sort of struggling with an addiction, or for that matter, who are struggling with, a real sense of depression or anxiety, is that you can start having these troublesome thoughts, or these resentful thoughts that will start sort of driving your thoughts more and more. And it can be very important or very helpful to people to then air those out. And it's really striking as a psychiatrist how often people have talked to me and said, well, doctor, do you think X, Y, and Z? And I've said, well, X is probably true, but Y and Z are conclusions you're drawing. And here's a different way to look at it that seems more plausible to me. And people will suddenly relax and be like, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. And that could be anything. That could be, my boss is busy, they don't actually hate me. That expression on my wife's face was worry about her ailing mother and not irritation with me talking to her. It could be a lot of things, but all of those sort of thoughts that tend to creep into people's heads, isolation tends to make them worse. They don't. And so one thing that I think is maybe a positive thing that's come out of that, if there are any positive things, is that a lot of people have been doing things like Zoom, 12-step meetings and support groups. I think for some people who feel socially awkward or feel uneasy in groups, that actually might be pretty liberating to be able to just sign into that and even keep your camera off so people can't see your facial expressions, or see what you look like, but they can just hear in there. I think right now that's a lifeline for a lot of people. And I really encourage anybody who's listening to this, who feels like they're having trouble like that, that is something, and people are finding that really helpful right now.
That's great. What a great show with Dr. Dan Krashin so far. Please be sure to share this with your friends and rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. You can check out our other shows as well. We talk about everything that can help heal your neurology. You can get all the details of our clinic and the services we offer through our website, centerforhealingneurology.com. One great option is to sign up for our newsletter, because that way you'll stay on top of everything as it happens and what it is. Remember, you can find out more about Dr. Dan Krashin there as well, and let's get back to the rest of our episode. Let's come back a little bit to Center for Healing Neurology. You will be joining our clinic. Who should come see you here?
With headache patients, there's a lot of different kinds of headache. I've been trained. So all of them, I think, some of the patients who I think might especially benefit are people who've had trouble benefiting from, just seeing their primary care doctor, or people who maybe have headaches as well as other kinds of body pain. In particular, headaches and fibromyalgia are a bad can be a bad combination. Or people who are having headaches that are very frequent, what we call chronic migraine, or other types of chronic headaches, especially when that's connected, as it often is, with depression and anxiety. I think that those are patients that can especially benefit from sort of a comprehensive integrative approach.
And what are the tools that are in your toolkit for treatment?
Well, there's really a lot. I do that. Medications are important. There are probably more options for headache medicines right now than there ever have been in history. So there's never been a good time to have headaches, I guess, but this is a better time to have headaches than 10 years ago. We've got more options there. But medications alone often will not do the trick. And so a lot of us will also talk about lifestyle modifications and behavioral changes, so things like relaxation therapy, biofeedback, self-hypnosis type techniques. In some cases, patients will really benefit from procedural treatments. Those procedural treatments are sort of on hold right now with elective procedures, but pretty soon we'll be able to do those things like nerve blocks for selected patients. Those are really helpful. And while there's medication involved, it's not like a pill you're taking every day. Those can be very helpful. Exercise therapy is also really helpful, and that is both. That's both the form of different kinds of aerobic exercise, which I counsel people on, and then specific exercises for the neck, because most people have some issues with their neck muscles. Your neck works all day long, keeping your head from flopping over. And so the neck can get pretty tired and stiff, and that actually can trigger headaches in a lot of patients. The
first medical training I ever had was a wilderness EMT, and they described that part of our body as a bowling ball and a shoestring.
That's a good way to put it. I usually use the analogy of like a 10-pound bag of flour balanced on a stick of bamboo, but yeah, it's the same idea.
Yes.
And then a really exciting new area of headache medicine that's come out recently is what some people are calling electroceuticals. I think that's a weird word, but basically it's different kinds of electrical stimulation to affect headaches. And the basic principle is that your nerves work on electricity, and headaches are all basically conditions of the nervous system. And neuroscientists have found that by stimulating the nerves with the little electrical signals, you can either make nerves either more active or you can kind of put them to sleep. And so they've developed more and more devices that can do that. And one of the really nice things is that it's much easier and much quicker for a couple of software engineers and electrical engineers to build one of these devices, test it, and get it approved by the FDA than it is to do a medicine. If to create a new medicine costs, over $10 million, and it takes a decade. But if you have a great idea for an electrical stimulator, because they're not using a lot of electricity and they're not dangerous, the FDA is pretty quick to approve them if they actually work. And so there are more and more options coming out on the market. And I've had some patients who've had just fantastic results with them.
Oh, fascinating. That's interesting. Including things for like gastroparesis?
I'm not familiar with treatments for gastroparesis. Okay. Honestly, I'm sure they're working on it. That'd be trickier because you'd have to get the electrodes down in the stomach or close to it. The advantage with headaches is that your head is right out there, and so you can put electrodes all over it if you want.
Great.
I will say that they've developed some interesting techniques for what's called non-invasive stimulation, where you put the electrode on the skin and then it will stimulate nerves deeper down. And that's something which is actively being researched. And so I think over time, like I said, I think that this area of medicine is evolving much quicker than pills and other pharmaceuticals are evolving. And so I wouldn't be surprised if more of those types of technologies become available in the near future.
That's amazing. Some of these devices we already know, like the Cefaly, might fall into this category of electroceuticals.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good example.
Okay, so Cefaly is a migraine device that to me looks like a princess tiara that kind of goes across your forehead and does some stimulation. There's TENS units, which also are similar.
Correct.
What are some of the other ones that you've used?
Well, there's a device called an H-wave, which is a sort of like a second generation TENS unit that it's kind of similar, but it uses a different, more advanced stimulation program. I've had some patients do quite well with those. There is a device called a GammaCore.
We do have that here at our clinic, so patients can come try that here, and we do prescribe it. But go ahead and you can describe it. That would be great.
Yeah, the GammaCore is a little device that it basically it's about the size of a pack of cigarettes, and it has two knobs on one end. And you put the knobs on your neck right next to your windpipe, and then it sends a signal. And this is the sort of non-invasive stimulation I was talking about, where it goes right through the skin and it stimulates a nerve called the vagal nerve. And that vagal nerve is very important to controlling our autonomic nervous system. So it controls things like how fast or slow your heart beats and your blood pressure, and also how basically the level of activation of your brain overall. And so they've been able to fine tune the signal so that it affects just the brain without affecting your blood pressure or your heart rate. And so this can be very helpful for people with migraines and for cluster headaches. And again, it's nice because it has very few side effects. I've tried it myself in a headache conference, and it gave me kind of a pleasant tingly sensation all over, but it didn't do anything else. So like I said, these are generally treatments that people can use with confidence. Then there's a very new one called a Nervio, which it looks a lot like the old iPod minis, if that may be an obscure reference to people, but basically there's a little armband that goes around your upper arm and a little box that goes on that armband, and you pair it with your smartphone, and then you use the smartphone to turn it on, and then it sends a signal into the large nerves of your arm. The arm has a really big nerve plexus called the brachial plexus right in your armpit. And so that acts as sort of like a superhighway going straight into your nervous system. And so it sends a signal into there, which basically acts as, maybe you could call it like a third generation TENS unit in a way, where it basically sort of scrambles and calms down the pain signals coming from elsewhere within the nervous system.
And is that for pain anywhere?
Right now it's approved for a headache.
Headache. Okay, still headache.
Right.
Okay, great.
And I've asked the distributors about using it for pain elsewhere, and because of FDA regulations, they aren't really allowed to say it. To me, it seems like it would be helpful for other things. And I'd love to use it. Have patients with fibromyalgia, for example, who have whole body pain. I'd love to have them use it and see how it works, because I would expect it to be helpful based on its mechanism, but I don't have any data about that as yet. It's kind of an unanswered question.
And do you know frequency-specific microcurrent? Do you have any experience with that?
Is that the same as transcranial direct current stimulation?
It's a little. I think they are different.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's so many different technologies.
Yeah.
There are some interesting technologies that just use direct current to specific parts of your scalp, which it's not a very big current, but it's actually enough to make one side of your head a little more positive and one side a little more negative. Ooh. And people have been researching ways to affect that. There's some interesting applications with that because, our brains aren't perfectly symmetrical. People talk about left-brained and right-brained people, and that's really kind of pop psychology, but there's a kernel of truth to that. And this is a technology which is simple enough that people are just getting plans over the internet and trying it out for themselves.
Oh, wow.
But it's the research into it is only in the early stages. I'm not familiar with the frequency specific technology that you mentioned.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to say about procedures or techniques?
The importance of multimodal treatment in headache. I'd say that headache conditions, like a lot of medical conditions, they exist on a spectrum, and some people will get better with sort of the first thing they try. And not too many of those patients will end up seeing a headache specialist because they, maybe they try some things that they read about in a magazine, or they see their primary care doctor and they try one thing and it works great and everybody's happy. And those people are very lucky. Their problem turned out to be pretty simple, but there are an awful lot of people out there who have more complicated conditions. And honestly, there's some uncommon headache conditions out there, but more often people have headaches which have gone on for a long time. They've become sort of entrenched, and they're what we call treatment resistant, where at that point, even one medicine, even one great medicine, may not work that well, and it may not work that fast. And so what I think is really key is that we talk about multimodal therapy in patients like that. And what multimodal is a fancy word, but really what it means is just trying different things, sort of like the big menu in a Chinese restaurant where you try something from column A and something from column B. It's really important because each of these things works through a different channel, typically. And so we know that exercise, for example, helps headaches, but it doesn't help headaches in the same way or through the same mechanism as taking a specific pill does, or getting a occipital nerve block in the back of your head does. And so if you do 2 or 3 different things that work in different ways, then what you can have, or what we're hoping to get, is synergy, where then all these things will work together. And that is the advantage that typically the beneficial effect will kick in faster, and often it'll be with fewer side effects. If you're just counting on one treatment to do all the work, you may end up having to push that dose or the amount of it a lot higher, and it may take a lot longer to work. And so that typically, I usually recommend at least 3 or 4 treatments to start with. And I caution people. I say, hey, this may seem like a lot. I like to write things down for people so they can remember all the things we talked about. And I tell people, hey, there's actually a really big menu here. So we're going to try some of the things. It's a little bit like when you go to a new restaurant, you ask the waiter, like, what do people usually order when they come here? Maybe you want to try something which works well for most people and is relatively affordable and has few side effects. And if you've never tried that would make a lot of sense to try that at the beginning. But if you've tried that and you've tried a couple other medicines that are very similar to that, and it's still not getting you there, then maybe it's time to try something a little more exotic. What doctors would call a second line or a third line medication. And we don't call it second line because it's not as good. We call it second line because you typically don't try that until you've tried something from the first line, and then you go through it. And in my experience, if I'm able to develop a partnership with a patient, we're able to sort of have this kind of frank discussion with each other, and if the patient feels comfortable telling me, hey, this worked, but this I can't take it, or I took it for 2 months and I don't think it does anything for me. And we have this ongoing conversation. I'm able to get almost everybody dramatically better going forwards. Unfortunately, the inside of the head is sort of the original black box. And so with picking headache treatments, there are a lot of clues we can get from the way people describe their headaches and other aspects of them, and we can guess which medicines might work better, which medicines might be more preferable for this particular patient. But we don't really have a good way right now to, look inside your brain and see what needs to be adjusted or what needs fixing. So there's always going to be some element of trial and error there, where we have to work together and develop some mutual respect and trust to keep working together to find something that's going to work great for that person.
Great. So as our parting question here, I would love to hear a little bit about what's catching your interest right now.
Well, one of the things that I've been studying more is the field of lifestyle medicine. Mm-hmm. So last year I went to a headache conference where we had a section for lifestyle medicine, for neurology and headache. And it was really pretty interesting. And I discovered that there was this whole independent field of lifestyle medicine that you could actually study and become certified in. And so that's one of the things I'm pursuing now, is to try to really learn that. It's been an interest of mine for a long time because, like I said, it's something I address with almost every patient already, but I hadn't really realized that the field has become pretty scientific, and there's a lot more evidence there than people might think. What I mean is scientific evidence that they've actually tried a lot of things and found some things which seem to consistently work more than just anecdotes. And so that's a really exciting area for me to be learning about. The other area that I've been working on is a type of psychotherapy called ACT therapy, which is it's basically one of the types of psychotherapy which is kind of a distant offshoot of sort of Buddhist psychology and mindfulness, where part of the idea of ACT therapy is that it's very normal to have bad feelings, self-deprecating thoughts, lack of confidence, and that part of the idea of ACT is helping patients accept that part of what is making, for example, a sad thought so difficult to deal with is the fact that they really don't want to have that sad thought, and they're trying really hard to push it out of their heads. And so that's one of those, the summary doesn't really do it justice. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's a really fascinating area, and it's been addressed a lot for chronic pain in recent years. ACT stands for acceptance and commitment therapy. And sometimes people have sort of simplified that as you just need to teach people to accept their chronic pain. I think that's a really horrible way to put it. It's and I've seen people blow their top when they've had ACT therapy suggested to them that way. So that I want to make it clear that that's not what it's about. It's not about just learning to accept and put up with something. That's really not the idea, but it is an interesting what we call an evidence-based therapy. And like a lot of these psychotherapies, it's been used in lots of different areas, and it's been used in chronic pain for a while. It's very recent that it's been used in headache medicine, so that's another area that I'm pursuing.
Fantastic. Well, if you're open to it, I think we have a lot more to discuss. The thing that I was trying to remember before that I just remembered is talking about central pain sensitization. And so that's a very big topic. And if you're open, I would love to do another podcast, maybe in another month or so, and we can just talk about
terrific.
Fibromyalgia, central pain sensitization, how we use things like ACT or whatever else to kind of get to wedge open a space so that people can think and recover and heal.
Sure. I'd love to do that. If we could we could talk maybe a bit about chronic fatigue syndrome too. I think all of those areas are really intimately linked, and that's a really fascinating subject. I think it's extremely relevant to the headache audience too.
Absolutely. And I just want to mention that all of the things that you're saying, especially here at the end, in terms of multimodal approaches and in terms of the ACT therapy, what I'm hearing is not really accepting the physical pain, but accepting that we will have feelings about what we think, and accepting what those feelings are, to be able to look at them more frankly and more practically. All of those concepts were built into Ayurveda 10,000 years ago. So Ayurveda 10,000 years ago talked about multimodal therapy, talked about lifestyle medicine, talked about that really who we are and what we think and feel and how we feel comes from the moment by moment awareness that we have about our day and how we breathe, what we do with our eyes, our bodies, our food, paying that very close attention and even really balancing that those now and later brain circuits.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the secret. That's kind of the secret history of modern medicine, I think, that people don't always talk about that much, is that in the in the late 50s and 1960s, a bunch of Californian doctors started, hanging out with hippies and learning about Asian philosophy and Asian medicine. And a lot of them were pretty young, and over time they sort of started codifying some of these things and then smuggling, and at least in psychiatry, they've sort of been gradually smuggling a lot of these ideas into medicine under names like dialectical behavior therapy and a mindfulness-based stress reduction and ACT therapy and all these things. And all of them, if you have studied Ayurveda, or if you've studied mindfulness or Buddhist meditation, a lot of it is going to be like, hey, this is kind of a secularized, cleaned up version of pretty much the same insights. But I feel so. There was a really interesting book called Witch Doctors and Psychiatrists by a psychiatrist who argued that psychotherapy was basically sort of the shamanic healing for science-minded Western people, where instead of, if someone is having trouble with their inner life, instead of wrestling with the bear spirit, we deal with their Oedipus complex or something. But it's all basically the same stuff in different garb. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yes.
Yeah. And then we haven't even talked about psilocybin or psychedelics. So,
right. That's
but we should probably. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Do you have any last parting thoughts about what we've talked about today?
No, it was great to talk with you. It's been a far-ranging conversation.
Absolutely. And I love that we've kind of gone everywhere from electrical stimulation for the brain, specifically for a headache, to the social injustice that's causing a lot of our addiction and stress and trauma, and with the recommendation, your excellent recommendation to start with food banks. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to connecting. And if you're interested in seeing Dr. Dan Krashin here in clinic, please do just call our front desk, 206-379-1213, or you can email us at reception@centerforhealingneurology.com. His hours currently are limited, but they will be growing in time, and we'd love to have you. We're excited to have you on board. Dr. Krashin, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today with Dr. Dan Krashin. We've got lots of ways to continue this conversation through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can get more information from and about us on our website at centerforhealingneurology.com. Or even better, come see us in person in our Seattle-based clinic. We are indeed open for clinic procedures like exosomes, stem cell therapy, IV therapy, VASPER, hyperbaric oxygen, and visits that require an evaluation. We are also available for remote telemedicine visits. Please be sure to share this show with your friends, and we welcome your rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And feel free to send topic requests to podcast@centerforhealingneurology.com. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make our whole world medicine. We rise or fall together and are committed to doing what we can to make as many of us as healthy as possible. And this takes all of us, including you. Thank you for listening. See you next time.
Partyfish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org or realrentduwamish.org.